in the year to 71%, genetically modified food up 12% to 63%, electromagnetic radiation up 10% to 49%, and gambling addiction up 7% to 34%. So the issues that are bugging Australians are basically about what is going to happen to our sovereignty. They went on to say that over 60% of Australians are sick of sleaze and sex in TV ads, which is the dead opposite of what you'd expect if you watch Channel 10 and Channel 9. People have had a gutful of it. They're not wowsers, they just are sick of having it stuffed down their throat the whole time. So something is happening that is dramatic, and we've got to work out how we got here and what is going to happen about it. You see, go back to that Commonwealth Bank in just before 1924, 1923, this young guy who'd run the bank so successfully died. Very young, unexpectedly, and in 1924 we had a federal election and they changed all the legislation, and they took that Commonwealth Bank and they said, we've got to put this under a board, you know, you can't just have one person running it. And so they established a board that came from the private banks. And they made sure that bank never competed against the private sector ever again. And within, 6 years of that, we were in the second great disaster of this century, the Great Depression, which none of us know anything about. But if you'd lived in Australia at that time, the agony was intense. There was no dole. There was... you could only get a handout if you walked to different places. You could never pick it up at the same place twice. So they had over 1 million Australians walking along the road, many of whom would just work all day for a loaf of bread. They would chop wood or do anything. The only thing that kept this nation together was the digger spirit. Everybody was trying to help everybody else, but it was agonizing. And yet there was more production in Australia than ever before. And the Australian Prime Minister at that time couldn't understand it. How can this happen? How can we all starve when we got so much food? How can we actually be jobless when there's so much to do? And he wrote a pamphlet at the time because the British government, which for now was back lending to Australia, sent out 2 emissaries to Australia who said, you've got to pay your debts, Australia, before the people even eat. And so Billy Hughes wrote this on the Great Depression. It's staggering stuff. Nothing better exemplifies the baffling complexity of modern production than the present situation in Australia. Trade is depressed, are unemployed and numbered by tens of thousands who walk the streets of our great cities and tramp the country roads downcast and in many cases dependent for food upon charity. While their country is a veritable Garden of Eden in which blooms in luxuriant profusion almost everything that man could desire, we have a population of a little over 6 million people, many now in sad trouble. Yet we shall produce this year enough wheat to feed 30 millions, enough wool to clothe 100 millions, and meat, butter, dried fruit, sugar, and other kinds of food and raw materials, including minerals and metals, sufficient for double or treble the present population. And yet they say Australia is in a bad way because we produce too little. Wealth in abundance meets the eye on every hand, yet men are unemployed and trade is depressed. Surely the trouble does not rise because we produce too little. Yet Sir Otto, the guy they'd sent out from England, says we ought to produce more. And a new slogan came in. The world is short of materials, everybody's got to work harder, tighten their belts and produce more. And they're doing exactly the same now in the year 2001. What happened was the Depression was used to repeat what had happened in America at Jekyll Island, where they established a central bank that was privately owned, and they tried to get central banking in every nation. And we ended up under central bank economics, which is disastrous. And they're now trying to merge the central banks into one world central bank to control the whole thing, if you want to follow what's going on. So there was design behind it, and this design finally blew out into the open. There was a lot of speculation during the Depression about whether there is a conspiracy, or how does the money system work? All the economists said it's not a money problem, it's a production problem. All we've got to do is tighten our belts and export more and get more money back from overseas, and that's going to fix everything up. And the chief economist for the whole of Australia, whose name was Douglas Copeland, held a big meeting in the town hall in Melbourne. to give his theory, how to work our way out of the Depression. Tighten our belts, pretty hard stuff if you're starving. Work harder, ridiculous if you can't get a job. And let's export it. 2,000 people went into the Melbourne Town Hall to hear his theory. And at the end, there wasn't much of a clap, but there was a question period, and a farmer got up and he asked a question. Tell me, Sir Douglas, you say if we import less and export more, we're going to be better off. That's it, said Sir Douglas Copeland. Okay, well, if we increased our exports by 25%, cut down on our imports by 25%, things are going to be really good. You're sure right, he said. So if we increased our exports by 50% and cut our imports down by 50%, we're going to be better off still. Sure. Well, said this farmer, suppose we exported every bloody thing we've got. We cut our imports down to nil. According to your theory, we've reached the promised land. And 2,000 people rose to their feet and booed Sir Douglas Copeland out of the hall. Now, we're being persuaded that the problem is basically a production problem in the world at the moment. The way to get out of that is lean and mean, free trade, and everybody export to everybody else, and somehow that's going to fix it up. And if we could double our exports out of Australia, we're going to be better off than anybody else. There's only one problem with that theory, and that is that every nation in the world is being told the same thing. And if every nation is trying to export its way out of debt, how do you solve it? Particularly when the evidence is now out, which came out from an economist at McGill University in Canada who decided to look at this picture, and he put every export and every import in the world onto a computer to try and get a model out, right at the end of the 80s. And when he finally got every deal in place and every payment in place, out of this computer came a model that just blew everything. The world was now running a trade deficit with itself of over $100 billion every 12 months, which blows every economic theory taught to every university student out of the water. They're always taught that trade balances. If there's a deficit here, there's a credit there, and if you ever got a picture of the whole thing, it would nicely balance. So he wrote to the International Monetary Fund, Professor R.T. Naylor, and he said, are you aware of this? And after 3 months, they wrote back saying, yes, we are. The figures have shown us this, but there is no logical explanation for it. So we just put it in our balance sheet every year under the heading of asymmetries. If you don't remember anything else I say, just remember the word asymmetries. Very useful. Somebody comes up to you and asks you a technical question, you don't know what the answer is, you just walk away in a lordly fashion and say, well, that comes under the heading of asymmetries. And they all say, oh, what a genius, I never thought of that. What it means is, I haven't got the first clue what the answer is. But if we've produced a financial system that compounds the deficit every year, and we say to all the ingredient parts, there's only one way to solve your economic dilemma, and that is to trade your way out of it. We've got the ingredients for the biggest human conflict of all. So the thing blew out of the water when a top historian in America produced a book in the 60s. His name was Carroll Quigley, Tragedy and Hope. And Tragedy and Hope was called Tragedy and Hope, The History of the World in Our Time. And Carroll Quigley, who was the best-known historian in America, said, I have been given access to the private papers of a group of international banks who are going to use the money system to try and produce a world government. He said, actually, I think there's some good ideas behind that, but he said it finally solves the problem about whether there is such a thing as a planned movement for world government or not. And the actual book contained these words. I know of this operation. I know of the operation of this network because I have studied it for 20 years and was permitted for 2 years in the early 60s to examine its papers